My name is Elena Marsh. I was 22 when everything changed, though it would take me years to understand how deliberately it had been arranged. I grew up in a house that never quite felt like mine, in a town where the light came through lace curtains my stepmother had chosen, in rooms furnished around her taste, not mine. My father remarried when I was 9, 3 years after my mother died, and for a long time I told myself that Diane's coolness toward me was just how some people showed love, sideways, guarded, never quite landing. Diane had a daughter, Priya, a year younger than me. We were raised like sisters, dressed sometimes in the same fabric, photographed at the same angles, but never measured the same way. When Priya struggled in school, it was called a phase. When I struggled, it was called a character flaw. I learned early to expect less and to be grateful for whatever I got. I met Julian the summer I turned 20. He worked at the small architecture firm downtown, and he had a way of listening that made me feel, for the first time, like my sentences were worth finishing. We dated for 2 years. I brought him to Sunday dinners. Diane complimented his shoes and asked about his family's money in the same breath, a habit of hers, kindness with a price tag hidden inside it. I didn't see it coming. I want to say that plainly, without the drama people expect from stories like this. There was no dramatic scene, no shattering glass. There was only a slow erosion, so gradual that by the time I noticed the ground was gone, I was already falling. It started with small overlaps. Priya needing a ride Julian happened to give. Priya showing up at gatherings I hadn't invited her to, always seated beside him, always laughing a beat too long at things that weren't especially funny. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself jealousy was beneath me, that trust was something I owed the people I loved. Diane began speaking of Julian as if he belonged to the family in a way I didn't. "He's so good for the Marsh name," she said once, and I remember the sentence landing strangely, like a door closing somewhere in another room. I confronted no one. That was my nature then, patient to a fault, always waiting for evidence before I allowed myself to feel what I already felt. I kept a small notebook that year, not out of suspicion exactly, more out of a need to hold on to my own perception when everyone around me seemed determined to make me doubt it. I wrote down dates, small phrases, the particular silence that fell over the table when I walked into a room mid-conversation. By the time Julian sat me down in his car outside my apartment, the engine still running, and told me he'd realized his feelings for Priya were different, deeper, more honest, I already knew. I had known for weeks. What I hadn't known was that Diane had been the architect of it, quietly steering, quietly seating, quietly suggesting, until the boy I loved had been rearranged into someone else's life, like a piece of furniture. I didn't cry in front of him. I have always been careful about where I let my grief live. I drove myself home, climbed the stairs to my apartment, and sat on the floor of my kitchen until the streetlights came on outside my window, and only then did I let the sound out of me. Not a scream, just a long, low exhale of everything I had been holding since I was 9 years old. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from losing something you were never allowed to fully have. I grieved Julian, yes, but underneath that I grieved something older, the family I had spent 13 years trying to earn a place inside of, only to discover I had been auditioning the whole time for a role that was never going to be mine. Diane called 2 days after Julian ended things, her voice light, almost cheerful, as though she were delivering good news. "I know this is hard, sweetheart, but Priya's happiness matters too. You'll find someone. You always land on your feet." I remember staring at the phone, at the small rectangle of glass holding her voice, and thinking, she has already rehearsed this. She has already decided what version of this story she will tell at dinner parties. The version where I am resilient and unbothered, where nothing was taken from me because I am simply the kind of person things don't stick to. My father, when I told him, did what he always did, retreated into a careful neutrality, a peacekeeping so total it left me alone on the battlefield. Diane wouldn't do that on purpose, he said, which was its own kind of answer. I moved through the following months the way you move through a house after a flood, cataloging damage, deciding what could be saved. I stopped attending Sunday dinners. I let calls go unanswered for days at a time, not out of spite, but because I needed the silence to hear my own thoughts again. It was during that silence that I began, without fully naming it, to build something. Not a plan for revenge, not at first. Just a habit of paying closer attention. I started keeping records the way an analyst keeps records, not out of paranoia, but because I had spent my whole life being told my perceptions were wrong, and I was tired of not having proof for myself, if for no one else. I threw myself into work. I had a talent, it turned out, for the kind of careful, patient analysis my job required. Reconciling numbers that didn't add up, finding the small inconsistency hiding inside a much larger, more confident story. My manager noticed. Within a year, I had been promoted twice. There was a strange comfort in a field where the truth, eventually, always surfaced, whether or not anyone wanted it to. Julian and Priya married 18 months after that car ride outside my apartment. I wasn't invited, which I understood to be its own small mercy. Diane sent a photo anyway, unprompted, captioned only with a string of hearts, and I remember looking at it for a long time, not with the devastation I expected, but with something quieter. A kind of recognition. This is who these people are. I no longer have to wonder. I didn't forgive Diane that year, and I didn't plot against her either. I simply began, brick by brick, to build a life that did not require her approval to stand. It was slower than revenge. It was also, I would come to understand, far more durable. By 25, I had left the town I grew up in. I told myself it was for the job. A firm in the city had recruited me for my analytical work, the kind of role that rewarded exactly the skills I had built in the quiet years after Julian, but the truth was simpler. I needed distance from a family that had taught me to distrust my own reflection. The city gave me anonymity, and anonymity gave me room to become someone Diane had never met. I made friends who knew nothing of the girl who used to sit at the edge of the table, waiting to be noticed. I dated occasionally, cautiously, learning slowly that not every kindness came with a hidden ledger. I spoke to my father twice a month, brief calls that never touched the deeper water. I heard about Diane and Priya secondhand, in the careful, edited way families relay news they suspect will hurt. Priya and Julian bought a house. Priya and Julian were trying for a baby. Diane had started a small event planning business, using, I noted with a private, wry amusement, several photos from my old apartment as before and after staging examples on her website, without asking. I didn't reach out to correct it. There was a version of myself a few years earlier who would have needed to say something, who would have needed Diane to acknowledge, even in some small way, what had been taken. That version of me had wanted an apology so badly it had shaped itself around the absence of one. But grief, given enough time and enough distance, changes shape. What replaced the need for an apology wasn't indifference. I want to be honest about that because indifference would have been its own kind of lie. What replaced it was clarity. I understood now that Diane's approval had never been a stable thing to build a life on, and that the years I'd spent trying to earn it had cost me more than Julian ever had. I started writing again, something I'd loved as a girl, and abandoned somewhere around the time I learned to make myself smaller. Nothing serious, journal entries, mostly fragments of memory I was trying to understand from a safer distance. I wrote about the lace curtains. I wrote about the notebook full of dates. I wrote about the sound I had made on my kitchen floor the night Julian left, and how it had felt less like heartbreak and more like something in me finally being allowed to speak. It was in one of those entries, almost a full 3 years after that night, that I wrote the sentence that would end up meaning more than I intended. I am not interested in punishing her. I am only interested in no longer needing her to see me. I didn't know yet how prophetic that sentence would become, or that within a year, Diane would be the one standing at my door, needing something from me for the first time in either of our lives. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of unremarkable day that makes the arrival of bad news feel almost obscene in its mismatch. My father's voice, when he called, had a thinness to it I hadn't heard before. "Diane's business," he said. There's been some trouble." The trouble, it turned out, was not a small thing. Diane's event planning company had grown quickly, too quickly, on the strength of borrowed money and a reputation she had built partly, I would later learn, on inflated numbers and clients she'd never fully delivered for. A larger firm had begun circling, threatening a lawsuit over a contract dispute that, if it went badly, could take not just the business, but the house, and possibly more. I felt, in that moment, a complicated cocktail of feelings I didn't try to sort immediately. There was no triumph in it, though I want to be honest that some small, tired part of me noted the symmetry, that the woman who had rearranged my life without a second thought was now facing a collapse she couldn't rearrange her way out of. Mostly, though, I felt distance. It was not my fire to put out. She called me herself 2 weeks later. I almost didn't answer. Her number still sat in my phone under a name I'd never bothered to change, a small, unhealed thing I hadn't examined too closely. But something made me pick up. Elena. Her voice had none of its old lightness. I need your help. She explained it haltingly, a woman unused to asking for anything, let alone from me. The dispute involved financial records, reconciliations, contracts, discrepancies she couldn't explain, and her lawyer couldn't untangle fast enough. Someone had mentioned in passing at some function I wasn't present for that I did exactly this kind of work now, professionally and well. I know I don't have the right to ask, she said, and there was a long pause after it, as though she were waiting for me to fill the silence with either forgiveness or refusal, and didn't know which she was more afraid of. I didn't answer right away. I sat with the phone against my ear and thought about the girl who used to sit at the edge of the dinner table, waiting. I thought about the notebook. I thought about Julian's car, engine running. I thought, too, about the sentence I'd written in my journal, I am not interested in punishing her, and wondered for the first time if I had actually meant it, or if it had simply been easier to write than to test. Send me what you have, I said finally. I'll look at it. That's all I'm promising. The records arrived 2 days later, a chaotic archive of contracts, invoices, and client correspondence that told the story of a business built on charm rather than structure. I recognized the pattern immediately, the kind of financial sleight of hand that isn't quite fraud, not intentionally, but is close enough to it that intention stops mattering to the people owed money. I worked through the documents in the evenings after my regular job, at my kitchen table, in the same kind of quiet I remembered from the night Julian left. There was something strange and almost meditative about tracing Diane's mistakes line by line, not vindictive, just precise, the way you might examine a wound you no longer feel obligated to flinch from. I found what her lawyer had missed, an early miscategorization in her accounting, made in good faith years earlier, that had metastasized under compounding interest and rushed bookkeeping into the debt now threatening to take her house. It wasn't fraud. It was carelessness, ordinary and human, the kind anyone might have committed under enough pressure and not enough oversight. I found, too, the paper trail that would let her lawyer argue the original contract's terms had been misrepresented by the larger firm from the start, a genuine defense, not a fabricated one. When I called to walk her through it, Diane was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. You didn't have to find that, she said finally. The part that helps me. I wasn't looking for a particular answer, I said. I was looking for the truth. It happened to be more complicated than either of us assumed. There was another silence, and in it I could hear something I had never once heard from Diane in 13 years of living under her roof. The sound of someone genuinely unsure of themselves. Why would you help me? After everything. I thought about lying, about giving her the clean, cinematic answer she probably expected, that I had risen above it, that I had transcended into some serene, untouchable forgiveness. But that wasn't quite honest, and I had spent too many years being told my honest feelings were inconvenient to start editing them now for her comfort. I'm not doing this for you, I said. I'm doing it because I know what it costs to lose the ground under your feet, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, even you. But that's not the same as saying what you did didn't happen, or that I've forgotten it. The case resolved months later, quietly, the way most real resolutions do. Not in a courtroom with raised voices, but in a series of amended filings and a settlement that let Diane keep her house and most of her business, chastened and smaller than before, but intact. She invited me to dinner afterward. I almost declined. Some part of me still expected the old dynamic to reassert itself the moment I walked through that door. The lace curtains, the careful hierarchy of attention, the small ways I had always been made to feel like a guest in my own family. But I went because I had learned by then that avoidance wasn't the same thing as peace, and I wanted, finally, to see what was actually there rather than what I feared might be. Diane looked older than I remembered, not just in the ordinary way of years passing, but in the way people look after being frightened badly enough to reconsider themselves. She'd made my favorite dish from childhood, something I hadn't realized she remembered. "I've thought about it a lot," she said, partway through the meal, not quite looking at me. "What I did with Julian."
She paused.
I told myself for a long time that I was protecting Priya, that she needed it more than you did, some stability, someone steady. I told myself you were strong enough to absorb it. I don't know when I started believing my own excuse. I didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. I had waited 13 years for a version of this sentence, and I found, now that it had finally arrived, that I didn't need it the way I once thought I would. It didn't undo the nights on my kitchen floor. It didn't hand me back the years I'd spent doubting my own perception. But it was, at least, true, the first fully true thing Diane had said to me in longer than I could remember. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," I said. "It isn't, and pretending otherwise wouldn't help either of us. But I didn't help you with your business to get this dinner, or this apology. I did it because I'm not interested in becoming a person who needs someone else's ruin to feel whole." She nodded slowly, and for once didn't try to smooth the moment over with charm, the way she always had before. She simply let it sit there between us, unresolved and honest, which was, I realized, the closest thing to respect she had ever shown me. I didn't leave that dinner transformed, the way stories like this sometimes promise. There was no single moment of catharsis, no music swelling as old wounds sealed themselves shut. What I felt, driving home afterward, was something quieter and slower, the particular lightness of a weight I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. For 13 years, some part of me had been waiting for Diane to confirm what I already knew, that I had been treated unfairly, that my instincts had been correct all along, that the notebook full of dates hadn't been paranoia but pattern recognition. I had built my sense of my own reality, in part, around the hope of her eventual agreement. And now that I had it, I understood something I hadn't expected. The agreement wasn't what had healed me. The healing had already happened, slowly, in the years I'd spent building a life that didn't require her permission to exist. I saw Julian once more, at a mutual friends gathering I hadn't realized he'd be at. He looked older too, tired in a way that surprised me. Priya wasn't with him. I heard later, through the same careful family grapevine, that they had separated the year before, quietly, without the fanfare of their beginning. He tried to catch my eye across the room, an old, familiar apology forming on his face, and I found, to my own quiet surprise, that I didn't need to hear it. I left early that night, not out of avoidance, but because I had somewhere else I wanted to be, a small gathering of the friends I'd built my new life around, people who had never known the version of me that waited at the edge of tables for permission to be seen. I am 28 now, writing this from an apartment with curtains I chose myself, plain linen, nothing ornamental, just enough to soften the morning light without hiding from it. I still speak to Diane occasionally, careful, measured conversations that will probably never fully close the distance between us, and I've made peace with the idea that they don't need to. Some doors don't have to be shut to be understood. They can simply be left ajar, opened only as far as trust allows, and no further. I think sometimes about the girl I was at 22, sitting on her kitchen floor in the dark, certain that something essential had been taken from her that could never be replaced. I wish I could tell her what I know now, that the family she was grieving had never been the whole of what she was losing, that underneath it was a version of herself who trusted her own perception, who didn't need anyone else's confirmation to know what was true. I found that version of myself again, slowly, in the quiet years no one was watching, in the notebook of dates, in the work that rewarded patience over noise, in the friendships that never once required me to shrink. I did not get revenge, not in the way the word usually promises. I got something steadier instead, a life built entirely without anyone's permission, standing exactly where I put it, in light I chose for myself. That, I've come to believe, is the only kind of justice that ever really lasts.